Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Director's Seminar of the Institute for Global Prosperity. I'm Professor Henrietta Moore, and I'm the founder and director of the IGP. We are exceedingly lucky this evening to have Torsten Bell giving the Director's Seminar. Torsten is the Chief Executive of the Resolution Foundation, which is one of the most important think tanks in the United Kingdom, combining exceptional analytical rigor with policy analysis. And Torsten himself has a background in economic policy, and his current research interests focus on inequality, the labor market, tax, benefits, housing, and wealth. In fact, pretty much everything that matters for the future of all of us. Prior to leading the Resolution Foundation, Torsten was Director of Policy for the Labour Party. He's also worked in the Treasury and as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors during the financial crisis, and as a civil servant. You can ask him about that later. Torsten is a trustee of the Child Poverty Action Group and a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. And today he's going to be talking to us about work, livelihoods, and welfare post-COVID. The Resolution Foundation responds rapidly and effectively to many of the economic challenges which face the United Kingdom as they happen in real time. And Torsten has been doing that through this week during the spending review. The economics of the coronavirus crisis have hit particular groups badly. And looking at policy and what we should do about them, what we should do about the balance sheet of the government, what we should do about the immediate structural changes that we need to make to navigate our way out of this crisis. All of this Torsten is going to explain to us now. So Torsten, please, the floor is yours. Welcome to the IGP.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Henrietta, and for the invitation in the first place. It's great to see an institute focusing on quality of life, generations, and policy engaged academic research. Those things are not always combined by all aspects of academia, so it's very good to see when it is, particularly, I mean, selfishly, they share many of the focuses of the Resolution Foundation, particularly on living standards and on generational issues. I've been asked to give a talk about COVID, but you gave me a reminder there of all the things I used to work on before. All we were allowed to work on was COVID, which is a bit depressing, really. But anyway, I thought I'm going to focus today specifically on COVID through a living standards lens in terms of what it is doing to households. But I will touch on some of the issues around what it's doing to the public finances and to firms and lots of other aspects, but principally through the lens of households. Now I'm going to attempt to share some slides. We shall see if the technology allows us to do this. Here we go. So hopefully you're seeing some slides at this point.
That looks great, thank you.
Great, okay, Henrietta is giving me the nudge. Right, okay, so I thought I would try and come at this in three aspects today. So let's just give you a warning about what you're going to get. So I'm going to first of all just talk a little bit about history, the lessons of history, before any of us had heard of what coronavirus, COVID, or whatever else you want to call it was. I'm then going to touch in more detail on the impact of this virus as it rolls out. And there I'm going to be relying principally on survey data that we have collected ourselves, given the challenges of relying on less than timely official data during this crisis. I'm going to focus on the experience in the UK because as a charity, that is our charitable purpose, but we can touch on which aspects of that we can see and don't see being replicated in other advanced economies. And then lastly, I'm going to move away from the Resolution Foundation's comfort zone of talking about what I can tell you we can definitely see in the data and talk to you a bit about what the future might hold, and slightly more speculative discussions about which aspects maybe of the changes we're seeing at the moment might turn into permanent changes for society or permanent challenges for policymakers, or indeed for all of us. So that is the plan. Hopefully that's vaguely what you're here for, but at least you know what's coming now. So you've either been warned or you can leave if it's not. So let's get going. So let's start with the history lessons. The reason I'm dwelling on this is because in the UK in particular, a discussion about living standards during COVID is really missing something if it doesn't remind ourselves what happened before. So I'm going to do this briefly. So this chart is showing you GDP per capita as a proxy for, very imperfect, but a proxy for incomes, at least at the national level, over the course of the years following the last three major recessions in the UK. So in green, the financial crisis of 2008, the 1980s Thatcher recession, and the 1990s ERM-based disaster. And I'm really only making one point here, which is, and again, I think this is forgotten, particularly if you look at just GDP rather than per capita. Some of this is hidden, but is that over the entire 12 years after the financial crisis, the British economy per person was only 5% bigger, and that compares to 30% bigger after both the last two major recessions. That was not normal. It's not what any of us, I was in the Treasury at the time of the financial crisis. Thank you for the reminder of that, Henrietta. And that is not what any of us thought was possible. There's some things that weren't as bad as we expected as well, but the general big picture trend was not what anybody expected coming out of the financial crisis. And strong aspects of that are shared across the developed world, even if not perfectly. Now, even more impressively, we managed to deliver this squeeze on incomes despite seeing record levels of employment in the years before the pandemic. That's just focus here on the red line. So pre-financial crisis in Britain, we thought full employment was 73% of the population. We thought that because we hadn't managed to get any progress above it for about a decade before the financial crisis. It had stayed there. And that was already higher than what we had been used to after quite high unemployment during the 80s and the 1990s in the UK. And it was above most of the rest of the developed world, but not all of it. Then what we then found is a not as big as we expected fall in employment during the financial crisis, but then fast, but more importantly, consistent rise in employment afterwards. In fact, that we learned that full employment was actually probably nearer 76% of the workforce. Now, there are lots of reasons for this, which we shouldn't go into here. The only thing to take away is that is a very large increase that no one would thought possible. It is 100% of it comes from female increased labour force participation. This is totally a story of gender, and that is also true in most of the developed world if you ignore the basket case that is the labour market of the United States when it comes to women's labour market participation. But this is all a story of women and their increased employment. So if incomes were doing very badly, but employment was soaring, what was going on? And this chart is the kind of defining feature of the political economy of Britain in the 10 years before the pandemic, which is to say that pay, having peaked just before the financial crisis in around the end of 2007, 2008, did not return to that peak until 10 years on, just before the pandemic hit. And again, we have seen nothing like that in any recession in the UK. In fact, we've never seen 10 years like that in modern British economic history. Now that again is driven by a wide range of factors, and that is the UK's experience on the depth of that pay squeeze is exceptional. It's particularly driven by high inflation hits during that financial crisis. But whatever the reasons, the experience of it for households has been of a very, very big squeeze on their living standards. And that is a defining feature both of our economics, but also of our political economy over the last few years. And that obviously, that issue hits into the squeeze that comes from the public spending that's talked about in terms of austerity over those same 10 years. So that is the backdrop, a feeling of squeeze for households before we hit. Obviously, that was different for different groups, and I haven't got time to go into that here, but actually it was fairly broad-based. Most people had a bad time during those 10 years, the rich, the poor, and the middle, even if for slightly different reasons. Right, let's get on with what is happening right now. And to make sure that it's clear the argument I'm making, I'm going to just start by spelling this out slightly. So look, in lots of ways, you will have heard on the media, you'll have heard certainly lots of academics producing papers saying that we know we're seeing a huge economic shock, falls in GDP that we haven't seen for 300 years. We know it's focused on the labour market because asset prices are not seeing big falls in this recession. In fact, staggeringly lacking in the falls we normally see. And we know that hit is focused on the young and low earners. And it is focused on the young and the low earners more than your average recession for reasons I'm going to come on to in a second. But what I want to argue today is that that is an insufficient. I then often hear people say on the basis of that, well, it's hitting low earners hardest, so this is a recession pushing up inequality, and that is an insufficient lens through which to consider the impact of this crisis, particularly on inequalities. And I'm going to argue that for 4 reasons. First of all, because it focuses on the individual worker, not on their household. Secondly, because it ignores the role of policy in protecting families from income shocks, or indeed, as I'm going to come on to later, exacerbating them. 3, because it is only focused on one aspect of the family budget, the money coming in, but doesn't focus on the money going out, levels of spending, which are crucial to this crisis. And fourthly, because we all care about our balance sheets. But not that families talk about them in terms of balance sheets, they talk about their savings and their debt levels. But all 4 of those things matter. So I'm going to now try and talk through using data from a survey, a recent round of a survey that we've done of British households, but that we've done a series of, to illustrate how you get from the hit to the young and low earners through these other stages to get to a full view of what this crisis has meant for British families. So first of all, from workers to households. So I'll start with the blindingly obvious, a huge fall in GDP this year, much, much deeper than the financial crisis. The OBR's new forecast out yesterday is for an 11.3% fall in GDP annualized for 2020. That will be the deepest, if it materializes, in 300 years since the Great Freeze damaged an agricultural economy in the early part of the 1700s. Now, that hit to GDP, as I say, is materialized through the labor market. And here I'm showing you from lowest earners on the left to highest earners on the right, lowest earners who were employed in February pre-pandemic. What was their situation when we got to September this year? So this is coming through the first lockdown, through the reopening, and before we headed into the second second wave of the pandemic that we're now all living with. And it's just showing you, like, just if you focus, for example, on the black bars here, we're showing that you are more than 4 times more likely to have lost your job if you were the lowest paid quartile than the highest paid. This gradient is very steep. Again, we do see gradients like this in most recessions, not all, but most. But it is very, very steep indeed. The same pattern applies to furloughing, but it isn't just, even if we look at those that were furloughed, who are more likely to be low earners, they were the ones that were more likely to lose their job when they exit furlough were also the lowest earners. So consistently, we see a pattern of the lowest earners being hardest hit. The same story is true for the young. It's actually, a staggering degree true for 18 to 24-year-olds in particular, where 1 in 5 of those that were working in February had lost their job by September. And that's even higher for some groups of our youngest workers. Now, there are good and bad bits about an economic crisis focusing on the young, their adaptability, their ability to protect their living standards because of their parents, for lucky ones, but we also know that has a long-term scarring effect on their employment prospects and their earnings for years to come. And that was shown very starkly for the generation that entered the labour market during the financial crisis. And the danger is that that is repeated today. Now, why are we seeing a crisis that is so focused on low earners and the young? And the answer is because this crisis is totally unique in how sectorally concentrated it is. So even the financial crisis, which was called financial crisis, was actually pretty broad-based in terms of its labour market effect across the economy. This crisis is not. It is focused on the face-to-face service sectors, in particular leisure and hospitality, where we are seeing 4 times the levels of job losses that we're seeing in the economy as a whole. Initially, I would have said that we expected retail to also be in that list. But because you've all gone and spent your money buying stuff that you would previously have spent eating out, actually the retail sector, after a really bad initial run, has actually been more resilient than we expected. So I think understanding that sectoral impact is key to understanding the individual impact of this crisis. Is also key, by the way, in understanding what successful macroeconomic policy looked like during the crisis, but I'm not going to dwell on that here. I just want to raise 2 other things from this chart. The first is to say that we expected this crisis to hit women harder than men in terms of job losses. And we expected that because women do the majority of low earning jobs because you will all have met the patriarchy. And one of its features is that that low earning jobs are in sectors where women are concentrated. We have been wrong about that, and we're now being consistently wrong about that, looking across lots of different sources of data. I'm just showing you one here. And one of the reasons we have been wrong, there are a number, but one is because low earning women tend to be public sector workers, whereas low earning men tend to be private sector workers in the UK. So that's one reason. The second reason is in the UK schools have reopened slightly faster than schools, say, for example, in the United States. And schools being closed has been an absolute catastrophe for female labour market participation over the past year in some places. And we did see aspects of that in Britain in the first lockdown, but that effect has eased over time. And I think, so I should say, it made a big difference to employment choices amongst parents. We've never seen any effect amongst non-parents on a gender basis. Amongst BME groups, we do see some big differences, although this data isn't granular enough to let us draw it much out between different groups. But as you can see here, we're seeing significantly higher job losses, again, due to the kind of jobs people do. I would highlight on some data, Bangladeshi workers being particularly badly affected. I'm talking here about the economic effect. You will all have seen very stark differences by ethnicity in terms of the health effect of this crisis as well. So what does that mean then when we take those labour market effects and translate them into household incomes? And I'm going to show you quite a lot of versions of these charts. I'll just explain it for a second. We're splitting the population into income quintiles here, lowest income at the top of the chart, highest income at the bottom of the chart. And we're going to then look at the different, how we describe what's happened to different families, households over the course of the last year. So this chart is showing you that if we take we take the adults in households in those different income quintiles and see what has happened to them, actually, it is not the very poorest families that saw the biggest labour market hit. So this is showing you the labour market effect to adults. So the red bar, for example, the very darkest red bar is showing you people that have lost their jobs who were working pre-pandemic. The reason why it's not the very poorest is that half of the adults in the very poorest families weren't working before the pandemic. And because of that, and because of that, and that this is a labour market crisis, when you put those two things together, you can see that the income hit from the labour market isn't concentrated amongst the lowest income families, even though it is concentrated amongst the lowest earners. And lots of low earners, remember, also live in higher income families, often because their partner is a high earner. So it's the second income quintile that is the most affected, not the bottom. I think that is important to understand. Now, so that's how we get the labour market effect and show you how the labour market effect is happening to families. Then we turn to what does policy do to intermediate that labour market effect as we've moved through the crisis? And the answer is an absolutely huge amount. And I think it is hard to understate. Like, policy has done a lot in every developed country over the course of this crisis. The UK, though, has spent more than almost any country, possibly than Canada. The increase in the deficit is also very large by international standards. I think there are reasons why you might think that's a good or a bad idea. Macroeconomics is a good idea. On terms of how some of the value for money of the actual spending has happened, it may be less wise in some aspects of it. But I'm just going to focus on a few bits of this now. And again, focusing on the labour market bits of that response. So this chart is showing you the number of workers that were furloughed on a number of different data sources since the end of March. And all I'm really saying to you here is the number is huge. Nearly 9 million workers were furloughed at the peak of this crisis. That's 1 in 3 of the private sector workforce. Like, the British state is not in the business of paying the wages of 1 in 3 private sector workers in normal times. And actually, the only time that we have spent more, the state has spent more as a share of GDP than it is this year, was in World War II. We've never come close to this in any other. It looks like it will be around 56% of GDP this year, up from around 40% prior to the pandemic happening. So first of all, a huge furlough scheme to pay wages. And then also very large increases in benefits were announced right at the beginning of this pandemic. These benefited families at the bottom, whether or not they were hit by the pandemic shock. And as a result, they did a lot to protect incomes for the poorest families, a lot. And for example, most families on universal credit will have seen their income rise by £1,000 this year compared to what it would have been without that benefit increase. So these are big rises that the government put in place. The government might have preferred to focus those on the families that actually lost their jobs, but couldn't do that with the benefit systems they had. So everybody got the money, basically. Now, what this chart is showing you, poorest families on the left, richest families on the right, is what we estimate would have happened to those households' incomes in May. So this is from a different data source, in May, with and without the big increase in benefits that took place. And what it's really showing you is that the labour market effect, for the reasons I showed you on the previous chart, would have been regressive across the income distribution. Bigger falls for poorer households. We don't show you the very bottom of the income distribution because the data is not exactly robust. Once we add in the effect on a modelled basis of the benefit increases, actually we move to a moderately progressive impact on incomes because it's so large. Now remember, this is on average, so there's lots of people losing much more than this and lots of people winning, seeing increases much more than this, but this is showing you the average effect of different parts of the income distribution. So policy is doing a lot. Then when we move to what that policy was, I think it's just, I'm sure most of you will know this, but I'm conscious not everybody is spending their life in Britain who's on this call. So just to remind us, the big things that have been going on are the job retention scheme, the furlough scheme, paying 80% of previous wages for workers who don't have work to do. And it was for the employer to decide if they were going to furlough their workers. So this is a much easier to access scheme than we've seen in some countries, mainly actually because we had no scheme like this at all before this crisis erupted. This has been completely dreamt up in very short order when the crisis started. It's not means tested in any way, so it's purely just paying your wages while you don't work. The self-employment income support scheme aims to replicate that, providing 80% of previous profits for the self-employed in grants. And actually, it's even more generous than the job retention scheme because you don't even have to have had a big cut to your income to claim this grant. So some people who are self-employed have done very well out of the last year, very well indeed. I have to say some people have done very badly indeed because we've seen very big hits to the self-employed during this crisis, and lots of them don't qualify for this support, maybe because they are either because they're higher income self-employed earning over £50,000, or because they're only recently self-employed, at which point the way in which the scheme operates excludes them from compensation via the scheme. So some big winners and some very big losers amongst the self-employed. But the big picture, which is very large grants from the government, not means tested, and tied to the previous level of profits you were making, is consistent with the job retention scheme. For both these schemes, I think it is important to understand how different they are to anything else that exists in the British welfare state. The approach we have got to for our welfare state since the evolution, since its kind of popular conception after the Second World War, is one where income support is provided at a flat rate of around £75 a week for a single person, almost whatever their situation, whatever they were previously earning, and that income support, including housing benefit, maybe support for children, is then also means tested. So if one person loses their job, for example, and your other person in the household has a good income, you will have the amount of support you receive while unemployed reduced to take into account your partner's income. Now, lots of countries have aspects of that, but other European welfare states are pretty consistent in having systems that look more like the ones that the UK has introduced during this crisis. Some element, usually temporary, of earnings-related unemployment protection for people that lose their jobs either permanently or temporarily after a crisis, and with less means testing, at least in the early phase of somebody's support package. So these are big changes for us. Now, what does that policy, when we take that policy and combine it with the labour market effect that I showed you in the first set of these slides, what does it do? Well, again, looking at lowest income families at the top, highest income families at the bottom, and the red bars are showing you decreases in income in September compared to where people's incomes were in February. What you see is a fairly even impact across the income distribution once we take into account changes in tax and benefit. It's still worse in the second quintile, who are the group that did see the biggest labour market effects, but it is much more even because of this big insurance system protection that the government has put in place. I mean, the other thing to state is the obvious, which is lots of people have had big falls in income. So that's 8% of the population whose income has fallen by more than 25%, even after those huge government support schemes that have happened. So that takes us to the role of policy. Once we take policy into account, what we're seeing is an equal hit to incomes. Does that mean we shouldn't worry about inequality, that this means that the effect of the crisis is being evenly felt? And I want to say here is no, that is not what is going on, and that's for two reasons. The first is that spending really matters. The amount that families have to or choose to spend is obviously of big macroeconomic importance, but it also affects the family budgets in a big way. And this chart is just showing you, compared to February, the percentage of households that had changed their spending patterns by, in the top bar here, during the first lockdown, so that's May, and in the bottom line during the reopening phase, that's over the summer to September. And the main point I want to make here is that if you just focus on incomes, you miss the fact that actually this crisis is about falls in spending. Like, why are low earners losing their jobs? Because rich people aren't spending in restaurants and in leisure facilities. That's what's going on. And so these lines are just reminding you that in the lockdown, 6% of families had decreased their spending by more than 5%, and nearly 30% had decreased their spending somewhat. Now, those falls in spending have now reduced as we've moved into the reopening phase of the economy, although they'll now be increasing again in this second lockdown, but they are still very significant, much more significant than we see in your average year taking place. But then the question is, who is doing that less? Whose spending is coming down? And if we just focus here on the right-hand side, this is again showing the same kind of chart, lowest income at the top, highest income at the bottom. Just focus on the green bars on the right-hand side. They are showing you that they're showing you the percentage of those different kinds of families across the income distribution for whom their spending has fallen more than their income, i.e. their reduction in spending is not being driven by income falls, but is being driven by other things, mainly that they're not having to spend because they can't spend in the way they normally would. The opportunity to spend is being constrained rather than the capacity to spend going because incomes fall. And these are big numbers. 35% of the highest income families have seen their spending fall more than their income. In many cases, that just means their spending has fallen, their income stayed the same. Yeah, so these are relative measures. These are not absolute measures. So actually, if you think about this in terms of family budgets, more higher income families have seen their family budgets improve, the 35%, than have seen their budgets worsen, the 24%. Whereas if you look at the lowest income quintile, you'll see that actually very few families saw their family budgets improve, because if you're poor, you can't cut your spending. You weren't going out to the restaurant 2 nights a week anyway, you didn't have a gym membership, and you need to pay for your food and your rent. Whereas the income hit has taken place there, you look at the red bars. So I think that understanding that it's the squeeze on family budgets that is regressive, not the fall in incomes, is what I'm trying to say in this section. Then how does that translate into balance sheets? Because this is probably the clearest place where we can see inequality increasing. So this is showing you the national accounts measure of the savings ratio. And like, the British don't save. I'm just reminding everyone of that. If you're British, you know you don't save. And if you're not British, you may have heard rumours the British don't save. There's nothing Germanic about the British people's saving habits. It flabbergasts me how stable this is. Even when we take absolutely huge recessions, we still carry on spending. But anyway, so this is the only exception to that, as this chart is showing you. Like, we're seeing absolutely staggering levels of savings. I could show you the same phenomena coming through. If you look at bank deposit data, it's all gone through the roof. So there's, maybe if some of you are students, this is affecting you less, but I promise you, everyone that is teaching you has got more savings than they've ever had in their lives. Now, who is that? Well, you know from the previous chart I showed you whose budgets are being eased, and the same pattern obviously follows on savings. So just focus again on the green bars. They're showing you which families are increasing their savings. And what I'm saying here is that 37% of the highest income families have increased their savings compared to only 12% of the lowest income households. And remember, obviously, I mean, it goes without saying, the lowest income families didn't have much saving to start with. But amongst the highest income families, some of this is really, really substantive. We're seeing people putting away, you know, thousands of pounds a month into their savings when we look at the detailed micro data for some of these things. This is a lot of money, and actually this is material to what happens when this pandemic eases and we find out whether the people will spend that money again or will just sit on it for the coming years. We need to all hope that they all get jabbed very quickly and start spending again come the spring. So higher income families are saving a lot more. Lower income families are borrowing, and they are borrowing to pay for everyday living costs. Again, this is from our own survey done in September. Half of the lowest income families have borrowed during this pandemic to pay for everyday living costs. Now, in general, lower income families are more likely to have borrowed for everyday living costs than higher income families. So some of this is a general pattern, or even though in general, higher income families are more likely to borrow full stop than lower income families because they buy cars and the like, not to mention houses. So savings up for high income families, borrowing up for low income households. So where does that's coming towards the end of what I wanted to say about how the crisis has played out across the income distribution, which is to say it is not as simple as people think looking at the low earner hit, but it is worse for low income households because of the inability to reduce their spending in line with income hits that is not constraining those at higher incomes, and because of the effect on balance sheets where higher income families' savings are rapidly increasing in contrast to higher debt for lower income households. And remember, this matters for the resilience. You know, everyone hoped this crisis, all the nonsense that was written about V-shaped recoveries back in May, everyone kept telling me it was going to be over in a few months. And I kept saying to them, show me any pandemic in history that has been over in a few months. Like, we wrote a paper back in the beginning of this pandemic looking at all the previous pandemics that had happened, admittedly not mainly in developed countries and not normally when we spend trillions of pounds on vaccine development. But the idea this was ever going to be over by the summer was for the birds, is my honest view. But which unfortunately is not a lesson we took. But anyway, right, the question is then, what comes next? So I'm going to talk about the bit where we have quite a lot of confidence, and then come on to the speculative part of this discussion. So on the confidence, what really matters is obviously how this second wave plays out and how quickly we get people vaccinated. And in the end, there is no differentiation between the economic and the health side of this crisis. The way to get the economic crisis gone is to sort the health side of this crisis. The reason why the UK has done, and some other countries have done worse economically than some countries, not all, but some countries in South and East Asia, is because of Southeast Asia, I should say, is because we haven't been able to control the virus in the way those countries have succeeded in doing. There's lots of reasons for that I'm not going into here, but those are clearly the background things that define what our room for maneuver is. There's no point saying you can open hospitality unless you've got the vaccination program underway, or that we've got back to warmer weather, which is why we're all going into tier 2, I hear, when this lockdown eases next week. The second thing to say is, while GDP, we're probably already past the worst part of the GDP falls for the country, because even this lockdown is nowhere near as severe as the one back in April and May. We are certainly not at the peak of unemployment, and that is because government support has prevented that fall in GDP feeding through into a fall in employment so far. And that's been true again with the recent extension of the furlough scheme in the UK for another 5 months to the end of March. What I'm showing you here, just focus on the dotted red line, which is the forecast the Office for Budget Responsibility, the government's official forecaster, set out yesterday. The good news is that they're much less pessimistic than they were back in July, when, if I'm honest, they had a far too pessimistic scenario for unemployment rising to 12%. That would have been a kind of riots on the streets kind of levels of unemployment. They're now projecting about 7.5% unemployment in the middle of next year. Now, that's not as bad. As a percentage of the workforce, it is lower than seen during the financial crisis. That may turn out to be slightly too optimistic, but we're still talking here about 2.6 million people. That's 1 million more people losing their jobs between now and then. So I don't think we should underestimate, just because this isn't the 1980s, all the Jarrow marches does not mean that that is not catastrophic for those individuals concerned. So a rise in unemployment of around 1 million expected by the middle of the next year when government support is withdrawn. Now, I've generally been quite polite about most of government policy so far in easing the scale of the hit to incomes. This chart, though, is saying to you that this is showing you, again, poorest families on the left, richest families on the right. What will happen in terms of income falls if the government goes ahead with plans to remove the temporary increase in benefits from the poorest families next April? And that is currently their plan, and that is what the Chancellor neglected to deal with yesterday when he made his spending review statement. And these are big falls in income. We're probably seeing something in the region of a 5% fall in income for the bottom fifth of the population if this single measure, which removes £1,000 from 6 million households in April, goes ahead. Now, my honest view is that it's almost politically inconceivable that the government will go ahead with that at a time when unemployment is rising significantly. But as I say, the figures in the government's forecast and in their plans are for this to take place in April. And that definitely shouldn't be happening, both for macroeconomic reasons. The idea that we want to take a load of income away from our highest consuming as a share of their income households in the middle of an economic downturn is very bad idea, leaving aside what it would do to absolute poverty levels and destitution. But that's not cheap. We're probably talking that would cost around £7 billion. So this is a significant sum of money. It's just the right thing to do. Right, I'm now going to touch on the speculative future and start with a word of warning, which is right at the beginning of this crisis, again, while everyone was pretending to themselves, they were in the first flush of enjoying not commuting and working from home. And when people are allowed to do that, particularly, I have to say, white men, what they like to do is write speculative pieces about how the world is going to be completely transformed by this crisis. And I want to give two warnings that I saw lots of them. The first is people wanting to focus, the picture on the left is showing you a silver lining to the crisis. And there was lots of people wanting to write pieces saying, look, yes, it's really bad. Lots of people are dying. But this will maybe help us, home working will be brilliant for the future. That will raise productivity, or it will save the local high street, or it will help us deal with climate change, with the kind of some of the more obvious silver linings people kept writing pieces about. Or if they were more of the activist mode on the right-hand side, they were saying this is going to be the jolt that means we stop going in one direction and we go in another direction as a society. This is the moment for total transformation. In general, it's the left that likes to say that. Whatever the crisis that's coming is, they like to say we're now going to have a completely different answer after the pandemic. People said that after the financial crisis. I'm afraid I'm too cynical and I've been around too long to think that is really how societal change happens. So instead, I'm going to suggest the best way to think about the lasting effect of this crisis is a bit less wishful thinking and a bit more hard thinking about which effects of this crisis are structural, i.e. we're probably speeding up and reinforcing trends that were either happening or at least were latent anyway, and which ones are cyclical, are actually driven by the crisis itself and actually pushing against the way in which society was already either changing or potentially changing before the crisis. I'm going to give you a concrete example here. So I said to you at the beginning, this is a very sectorally differentiated crisis. And some of the sectors where low earners work that have been hard hit, here's two of them to think about. One is hospitality. So think nightclubs, restaurants, hotels. And the other is the high street, where people have spent online. We've seen a big increase in online spending taking place, and we've seen high street businesses struggling. Now, one of those is part of a very long-term structural decline, the decline of retail on the high street. In the UK, that has been going on at least since 2003. The share of the population working in retail has been declining structurally since then. Actually, that isn't just about the move online, although that has sped it up in recent years. It's to do with where we choose to spend our money. If you give a British family an extra £1 today, outside of the pandemic, they will spend it on doing things and services rather than buying more stuff. or at least they'll spend a greater percentage of the extra pound on those services and less on stuff. And that is what was driving the decline in retail even before this crisis. Even before online shopping really got going in the last decade. So that is a structural decline. And so what the pandemic has done is just speed that up. It's sped up the decline of the high street, and policymakers should be worried that that is a lasting trend. In contrast, the closing down of our hospitality venues, eating out, going out, the gyms, all those kind of venues where we are seeing big hits to employment, and people have been writing pieces saying, well, these jobs are gone forever. I think that is complete nonsense. I think what I've got you, the picture I'm showing you here is of the roaring 20s, the 1920s after the last global pandemic. And it's called the roaring 20s for a reason, which is admittedly also after the war, but after that pandemic, what did people want to do? They really wanted to get out of their houses and get back to having a good time. And that is what happened. There's loads of dances were invented in that decade, as well as heavy drinking, and as well as some new ways of dressing, which you can come to your own views about whether they were an improvement or not. But my basic point is people are going to go back out once that this pandemic is over, and they're going to be spending in those hospitality and leisure ways. And we should not be assuming that those trends last. And that is both good news in some ways, because that means lots of jobs, particularly for young people. It's also bad news in the sense that some of those jobs are lower paid than maybe we would want our young people to be doing. Here's some other examples of where the crisis reinforces structural, doesn't deliver new cyclical trends. This chart is showing you household incomes. This is survey data here, not our own survey data. Household incomes for the working age population in blue, indexed to 2003-4, and the pensioner population in red. Now, most of you probably know this if you've got any older members of your family, but you definitely wanted to be a pensioner over the last 20 years when it came to incomes, because pensioner incomes are up roughly 30% over the 20 years since the start of the millennium, and working age incomes in Britain have hardly risen at all. Now, I won't go into the reasons for this. It's to do with a whole host of changes to both pension policy, benefits policy, very slow wage growth, amongst other things, and higher occupational pensions coming to fruition. But this divide has been happening, and the economic effects of this crisis are entirely being borne by the working age population, because they're all coming through the labour market so far. As I say, asset prices that would affect pensioners a lot haven't yet been falling, although I suspect they will at some stage. So first of all, generational divides will probably be exacerbated by this crisis, at least in the short term. Secondly, the pay squeeze that I started with at the beginning of this conversation will be deepened, because in the end, lower productivity growth is the real driver of the lasting pay disaster we are suffering. And the pandemic, if it has even a moderate permanent scarring effect on the size of our economy, this is showing you the Office for Budget Responsibility's forecast again from yesterday. They project an economy that is 3% permanently smaller. That roughly translates into £1,200 lower wages for every single worker in the economy by the middle of this decade. That's the gap between the blue and the red bars here, what we're expecting pre-pandemic in blue and what we're now expecting in red. So pay squeeze being tighter, that living standard squeeze being worse than we previously hoped it would be. In the really short term, this is now a cyclical effect. What we are seeing is that, despite, again, what you often hear said, actually, London is the hardest hit part of Britain by this crisis. Now, this is showing you on the left, it's seen the biggest fall in vacancies, and on the right, it's seen the biggest fall in employee numbers. Like, staggeringly stands out. Now, at one level, that is just because London is the only city that exists at a regional level in Britain. So our other cities are hidden within data that also includes. So it is, if I showed you other cities, they are also being disproportionately hit. And the reason for that is obviously that they're more reliant on people traveling to spend. The people traveling to commute to spend, or in some cities' cases, traveling as tourists or as students. And so when people stop traveling to spend, which is what happens in a pandemic, those places are very hard hit. So that is delivering levelling down, closing in one level regional gaps by hitting the richest part of Britain hardest. I think we should be cautious about assuming that all of the challenges of economic geography that have given us big gaps in GDP per capita across Britain, though, are going to go away after this crisis. I think London is going to have a tougher downturn phase, but I don't think we should assume that this is a permanent change. But some changes that particularly affect London will be more permanent. So here's one. You'll all have read pieces saying this is the end of the office. If I have one more chief exec telling me he's thinking of closing one of his offices, I'm going to go mad. This chart is showing you that people are overestimating how much what happens is that people move to totally home working, as they are doing during this lockdown. That's the black line, which shows you slow growth in total home working. That's their main place of work. What we have seen this millennium, which I think this crisis will speed up significantly, is the move of professionals. And remember, this is just professionals, which I'll come back to in a second, working at least some of their week at home, but still going into the office, say 3 or 4 days a week. And we've seen decent growth of that pre-crisis, and clearly that trend will have been accelerated by this crisis. So it's not the end of the office, it's a change in the hybrid nature of working for professionals that we're likely to see. That will mean rejigging of city space, slightly fewer offices, slightly cheaper offices. It could mean different people having, different cities chosen as the base for different firms. What it doesn't mean is the end of all agglomeration economics, all of the structural trends that have driven growth in certain ways over the last 20 years into large cities with good transport networks. Thirdly, on the cyclical and therefore don't assume it lasts trend, is the idea that Britain is going to respond to the experience of this crisis of lots of people relying on the state by moving to a new kind of social security network that does what we did during this crisis, insures people for a high percentage of their earning losses if they lose their job. So this chart is showing you, again, lowest earners on the left, highest earners on the right, how much of people's income was protected if they could rely on the furlough scheme during this crisis. That's the green line. And that's just showing you that you basically got to keep 90% of your previous income at the household level if you lost your job during this crisis, or you were furloughed during this crisis. But if you rely on benefits, because it is not tied to your previous income, in most cases, previous earnings, you see much lower replacement rates. And what I'm saying here is that having experienced that high rate during this crisis, I don't think we should assume we're going to stay there. The most likely scenario is we go back to the means tested flat rate system that we have been used to pre-crisis. Right, last lesson, which is just the only one where I'm talking about the public finances rather than household finances. Look, the government has borrowed a huge amount of money to pay for this crisis, £394 billion this year, more than double the peak of the financial crisis borrowing. That is driving a big increase in public sector debt. You can see that in the dotted red line going up on the public sector net debt line on this chart. Now, at one level, all the fiscal hawks start saying, well, this means we've got a complete catastrophe on our hands. I just want to remind you that the cost of that debt is in the end what matters for its sustainability. And that is what the green line going down and then becoming the forecast with the red dot at the bottom is showing you on the latest forecast. And actually, even though the levels of British debt have gone up a lot, over 100% of GDP for the first time since the 50s, the costs of that debt burden have been fallen because interest rates have fallen so far and so fast consistently. So our costs of debt are down. Now, that doesn't mean they're not riskier. Actually, that are, the susceptibility of our debt interest costs rising if interest rates rose has probably roughly doubled over the course of the last year. So I'm not saying we shouldn't think about the risks, but we shouldn't do anything hasty in terms of consolidation, given how cheap that debt currently is. And neither do I think the government or any political party is going to suggest that we do. I think that is important background to why we're not going to get a consolidation today, but we will get tax rises tomorrow, because a 3% smaller economy means that you need to raise taxes or cut spending in the medium term, and we can't cut spending because we did that for the last decade. So taxes are what is going to go up. Okay, then just to draw that all to a close in some fashion, I'm conscious it's quite hard to, given we've covered a lot of ground. So the pandemic so far, a big hit to low earners, but a fairly even hit across the households. Because family budgets are about what you spend, not just what you get in, though, it has led to a regressive impact on family budgets and how that's being felt. The result of that is that rich families have got better balance sheets and more savings, and that poor families have got more debt, and that particularly matters the longer a crisis lasts for. You may be able to live with an income hit for a few months. You almost certainly can't live with it without big changes to your life if it goes on for a year. Where are we next? Well, one big change, high unemployment will have a big effect on the economics and politics of how Britain changes in the next few years. But my view is that 2022 will look a lot more like 2019 than 2020, which is going to, I hope as a year, in terms of the economics, is a year hopefully unparalleled in any of our lives. And we should be careful about assuming temporary change is permanent, either because we're pessimists and we like to say this awful thing's just going to carry on, or because we're optimists and we like the fact that maybe because people cared about low earners doing risky jobs over this crisis, they'll suddenly start treating them better automatically. Structural changes are definitely being accelerated. The decline of retail and the growth of home working are the two that stand out materially. But living standards pressure, public finance pressure, and generational gaps have all just been made worse by this crisis. So my overall message is that even though the good news is that the crisis has led to policymakers recognizing some big problems in our society, like the insecurity of low-paid work, like the disaster that is the British social care system, we should not assume those just get solved when we come out of this crisis. It may be that we just all go dancing and drinking. And so the job for policymakers is to address those problems, but for all of us to recognize we're going to be addressing them against a more difficult backdrop. Solving climate change has not got easier because of this crisis, it has got harder. And the same applies to lots of the other questions we face as a society. I think, I know that's a rather grim message to end on, but I think that is the main takeaway about where a pandemic on this scale and this tragedy in terms of deaths leaves us. And so I shall wrap up there, Henrietta.
Torsten, thank you very much. Wonderful talk. First, before I start chatting to you, which is the standard format for the Director's Seminars, a few minutes of exchange between you and me. Could I just remind everyone who's on in the webinar, on the call, please, to put your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. This system is designed to help me. So if you could do that, that would be really great. And we're going to open up the floor in a few seconds. So Torsten, let's just, I rather agree with your timing. So I think that we're in a sort of 3-year run here. So 2022, yes, before anything really looks a lot better for all of us. But trying to understand then long-term trends in changes in spending, that's one thing. So you mentioned the fact that, the richer households, 37% of them have been salting away a bit of money. But, what do we know about what the rich were doing with their money before their savings, which after all, they weren't spending it anyway? What are they going to do with this money they've got? And what do we know about sort of long-term trends in spending in the economy?
That is a great question. And it really does matter for how you think about, actually, it really matters how you think about how even just the next month by month that this plays out for our economy. So obviously, like, getting the vaccine rolled out is the key to getting the recovery going, but the pace of that recovery materially depends on how better off households change their behavior. So the depth of the economic hit is caused by rich households stopping spending and that hitting low earners. That's like the easy bit of thinking about this year. What we need is for them to go out and spend. Now, the OBR, I had this discussion of this with the new chair of the OBR this morning on a webinar. So their forecasts are probably slightly on the gloomy end from the perspective you're talking about, which is that they basically don't assume that the rich come back and spend all that money, that it doesn't turbocharge the recovery particularly. I think that is a reasonable judgment given what history says about the rich spending less of their money in blunt terms than the poor. My personal view is that is slightly too pessimistic, because the way to think about this is the rich will go back to the level of consumption if the jet vaccine is effective, because a lot of these people are older, but they will go back to high level, the previous levels of consumption. I think that's a safe bet. And I think it's not unreasonable to think that they will go somewhat higher because everyone is so fed up. And there's only so much they can spend on DIY, which is what they're all spending on at the moment, improving their houses. So I'm a bit more optimistic, but I agree. That is not based on history, because that isn't what the last 2 decades has shown us. It's based on a view about the next year.
Yeah. But I mean, one way of thinking about this problem of the government behavior is that, government investment during times of crisis is absolutely necessary. And I mean, government, if the government were to turbocharge, jobs and growth in the next while, then the proportion of public debt to GDP could actually fall on these kind of projections that we have. But so there are a couple of questions there. So one is, do we currently think that the government's current plans for turbocharging the economy, do they have any, or are they just sort of still staring into the headlights and talking vaguely about levelling up, which isn't really a plan as far as I can see, it's just an aspiration. So one is, and what can we learn from the fact that after the financial crisis in 2008, they did exactly the opposite and caused this huge squeeze, which followed through and probably weakened the situation we went into in this crisis.
So there's a lot of things going on. There. So let's step back from the way I've talked about this so far, and then we think about it from the macroeconomics of where we are. So government has filled in the hole left by the huge fall in consumption that social distancing lockdown has left us. It's slightly more like, in general, that spending is being hugely reduced over the coming months. And in general, you would think about that as fiscal policy becoming less supportive of the economy. Yeah. I think it's a bit more complicated because the nature of the spending is not normal fiscal stimulus spending. It's kind of insurance against earnings losses in a more complicated way, because the supply side of the economy is also being reduced as well as the demand side. But let's park that. It's definitely true that some reduction in fiscal impulse is coming through next year, probably in the second half of next year, as the government steps back from that level of support. Our view is that is unwise to plan for. If some boom turns up, fine, but that is unlikely to be the right fiscal policy stance. And that is the reason that is so important, is because the Bank of England has no firepower left, so it cannot offset a mistake on fiscal policy by cutting rates, because it's got nowhere to cut them. And there's a reason why it can't do anything in this crisis, which is that it's at the zero lower bound, and its only real role is to ensure that the government can continue operationalizing fiscal policy by buying basically 100% of the debt that the government has issued so far this year. So my view is, yes, from a macro perspective, it's unwise to be planning what they're doing. In that context, what the Chancellor did yesterday is to say he's going to spend a lot more on COVID via public services in the short term, quite a staggering amount, 330 billion over this year and next year. But that he's going to reduce the underlying structural normal level of spending on public services, which is the bit that he didn't say in his speech, obviously. Now, there are tougher times to come. My honest view is that is almost certainly impossible for him to actually deliver. But anyway, that's kind of neither here nor there. But yes, your big picture is totally right about that. How that relates to what happened after the financial crisis is complicated. I think in retrospect, I think it's clear. It was controversial at the time. I think it's clear in retrospect that we all underestimated, in particular the UK government, the need to provide macroeconomic support in the years immediately after the financial crisis, particularly once it was clear what was happening in the Eurozone, which had a material effect on the UK economy, and is why unemployment took so long to come back down. I have to say, one of the things that really interests me about that issue is that the chart I showed you right at the beginning, showing employment hitting new highs, 76%, and earnings being a crater. Yes. Those two things are actually the flip sides of the same phenomena. And what happened, which I did not notice this until about 2016, so I'm not making any claims to having got it right at the time. But the reason why more people were working in 2017 than were working in 2008 is because people chose to increase their labor supply because of the hit to their family incomes from the pay squeeze, which is why second earning women all went to work in the last decade that weren't in the 2000s. Now, it's not to do with the march of like the march of like gender equality, which because it is partly that, but it is not just that. It is basically income squeeze leads to people being poor. I always say we worked more because we felt poor, basically, and we did not see that at all. Had we understood that, we would have realized that in those circumstances, big labor supply shock increase going on, you need to push much harder on macro stimulus to get to full employment, because until you get there, you don't get wage growth, the productivity growth, the virtuous cycle you get in an upside. So we never really got the boom, and not least, and that's before Brexit got involved with the whole situation.
Yes, no, I can see that. But one of the things that concerns me when we talk about macroeconomic policy, and this applies in many contexts of the world, including in the global south. So there's a great deal of emphasis and discussion about what's going on in the labor market, right? And that includes certain other things. So for example, you were talking about unemployment being 7.5%, which is what, 2.6 million people. And so the question that pops into my mind immediately is, who's got their eye on child poverty?
Yeah, well, so that is so no one is the honest answer, because not least because our measurements of child poverty are kind of don't really work when we're seeing, they're not very timely, they don't really work. My view is that semi-accidentally, and the big increase in benefits the government did at the beginning of this crisis wasn't well, it was not well, on the technical way it was done, it was not well targeted on children, i.e. it was per household, not per person in the household, on the simple level. But because benefits in Britain are quite focused on families with children, they're basically disproportionately people in their late 20s and their 30s with young kids. Actually, it probably did make quite a big difference temporarily to households. But you look at any other data, food bank usage in the UK, destitution, how some schools are talking about the inequality of education over the last year, is very hard to conclude that we've done everything we could as a society to look after the poorest children.
Yes, and also the long-term effects of that are very grave, of course, and it can include not only such things as education and skill acquisition and future employment, but actually for small children, even things like cognitive development, which is a lot harder to put right. So just before I open the floor, just one final question then about, the UK is one of the most regionally unequal countries in the OECD, and indeed, anywhere in the world, actually. So thinking about this high unemployment level, how regionally based is that? You said London, of course, has done very badly. But what I'm thinking about, so what's going to happen to this, the blue line of new MPs and those seats sitting right across that part of the, the United Kingdom? What was it really going to look like in sort of, do you think, in the Northwest, for example?
So I think this is definitely where I'm feeling more crystal ball territory. I'm certainly less confident. I'd say, first of all, I'd say the good news, which is that this isn't the 1980s. And I don't mean that in terms of the level of unemployment. I mean that in terms of the geographical spread of it is much wider. We haven't got what we had in the 80s, which was the disaster of very geographically concentrated job losses when a manufacturing plant or a shipyard closed or a mine closed. And when that happens, you get demand collapse in the entire local economy. There's no way back. So it's not that. Restaurants, shops, gyms exist everywhere in this country, and actually we've seen fairly broad-based hit, just big everywhere, basically, is what happened this year. The places that stand out geographically are city centres, where people have to, big city centres, and very the opposite, i.e. places that are tourist reliant, but you have to travel quite a long way to get to. So Cumbria, Devon, Yarmouth, like places that are on the fringes physically on the fringes of Britain, or the other area. And that is because both those kind of places are where people have to travel to spend. So it's a spending story driving it. My view is that both those places, it'd be very hard for the individuals, but the places themselves should structurally bounce back. The comparative advantage of Cornwall is having pretty beaches and having tourists. That is not going to have changed. And so I suspect that is not a lasting, it's not like the shipyards closing in that sense. My caveat to the thing I am worried about is where what has happened is a speeding up of an existing decline, particularly, for example, high street retail. And that is that the speed of that matters, not just the level of what happens, because basically what local places are in the business, successful local places need to do is to adjust their high streets from being retail destinations to leisure destinations. And then to do that, they have to be pleasant places.
Yes.
And the danger is the speed of the decline of the high street retail means that the transition to a successful leisure venue can't take place, because basically it's just the damage is just too great. And so I am worried about that, and that would disproportionately affect the kind of places you're talking about.
Yeah. So it's all boarded up shops and pound shops and so on. Yes.
Yeah, you don't go for a meal there, basically.
No, it's pretty grim, isn't it? Pretty grim. Let's open up to the floor, actually, Torsten. So I've got questions for you. So the first one is from David Bent, and he's asking, would it be fair to say COVID has revealed that the employment miracle of the 2010s was an unequal economy with time servants in hospitality and gig economy jobs? If so, then how do we avoid building back to the previous normal, which wasn't structurally sound, but build forward to a more equal economy with regional levelling up and not relying on pockets of super high productivity for, productivity growth, etc.?
So that's a very hard question.
It is.
Just a few thoughts. So overall, I don't want to say that all of the jobs growth in the 2000s was in bad jobs. I don't think that. If you look at the occupational change, that it doesn't stack that up. So we should focus on what specifically is true, which is, I think, that particularly the early growth in employment after the financial crisis, so the immediate, before we got into the last 5 years, so 2013 is when growth in employment really started picking up. The early phase of that, because of the large slack in the labour market and a very flexible labour market, was concentrated in insecure work. So a big rise in self-employment, not of the good kind, did take place then, and then was stubbornly stayed afterwards. I think that is, and if you look at surveys of those workers, they don't want to be doing that. It's not a choice in the same way. So I think there are big lessons specifically about that, and it also shows you've got to get to full employment and stay there. Like if you want good quality work, you need a tight labour market that lasts. That's what you need to get, and we took too long to realise that. Specifically, I think we published a lot. I've published lots of papers on how to improve things for low earners. So I have a long list of things that we should be doing. My honest view is that it's not that hard, basically. There's some of it is going to happen. So we will continue raising the minimum wage, probably to amongst the highest in the developed world by the middle of this decade. But low earners don't just need higher wages; they need control, power, dignity, and respect. But some of those things you don't need to totally kind of transform every bit of the labour market to achieve that. You could give people minimum. You have to know your shifts at least 2 weeks in advance. I mean, the fact that you don't have that is like staggering in the UK to most of the world. So you give people notice of their shifts. We pay most of our low earners now monthly in the UK. In the US, it's weekly or fortnightly. In the UK, it was weekly until the start of the 2000s. It's not a coincidence. That's the same time period when people moved on to monthly pay that people turned to loan sharks because they weren't getting paid. We could just require people to be paid weekly or fortnightly if they want to. There's lots of little things we can do. If you want a decent social care sector employing, as I say, lots of low earning women, well, then you have to fund it. Like there's not rocket science, some of this stuff. So specifically on the self-employed, we do have to fix the tax system, which incentivizes that pattern of behavior by employers and by workers, which is very difficult to do. And then we have to use the courts to go after people bogusly self-employing workers as the self-employed.
Yeah, absolutely. So now there's a question from Nikolai, who's on the panel, so he can ask it personally, which is Nikolai, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Torsten. Absolutely fantastic seminar. So you have talked about the rich, but I wonder if you can say a bit about the super rich and how the super rich are doing in the pandemic and where they fit in this picture. And I'm thinking here about a study that came out back in September about the US, and it found out that just the billionaires in the US had increased their wealth by 1/3 during the pandemic, to the tune of something like 850 billion in 6 months, right? So I suppose I wonder firstly whether there's something similar happening in the UK, and also what's going to happen with this huge wealth capture at the very, very top. And, you know, I suppose the rich, you know, might start spending again once they get jabbed, but I'm not sure that the super rich are going to start spending billions. So I was just wondering if you can say a bit about that and what your view is on this.
Okay, so that is a great question. So first I should say the obvious, which is none of the charts I showed you include the super rich, because obviously they don't answer Resolution Foundation surveys. So that is the first thing to say. In fact, they don't answer any surveys, which is why we underreport the incomes and the wealth of the rich, full stop. In another neck of the woods, we spend lots of time trying to correct data for those problems. I would say a number of things. One is, so the very rich, insofar as people have done work on the US, does show what you're saying, very large increases in their wealth, not necessarily in their income, some of them for their income, but for their wealth. I would caution us about generalizing from the US position on wealth to Europe and even to the UK. This is because, so for example, whenever I have like all of my friends that work in kind of versions of what I do in the US, who are now all going into like the Biden administration, always say to me, "Oh, we're looking at all these wealth taxes. Are you going to do them?" And I'd say, "Well, I've got a long list of wealth taxes I'd like to do in the UK, but just to be clear, you're like 0.5% tax on people with wealth of over 10 million pounds would raise exactly £0 in the UK, because we don't have those billionaires. Okay, the nature of our economy, smaller country without a large tech sector of that kind." That we just don't have the really, really globally wealthy don't exist in Britain, and if they do exist in Britain, lots of them are not tied to Britain. So the situation is slightly different. In particular, the tech wealth that is driving the new wave of billionaires in the US doesn't exist in the UK. What I think is true is when I think about wealth, the thing that worries me more in the UK, and is more of a generalized issue, so it's not about the very, very wealthy, although I'd like those people to pay some tax, and they're not going to spend any of their money after this crisis. You're completely right, obviously. Is more that so interest rates have been structurally falling since the 1980s. Okay, in the 1980s, wealth relative to GDP, i.e., relative to national income, was around 3 times, and it is now 7 times. Okay, so wealth has grown much faster than incomes because of that interest rate fall, which is what we're seeing. Part of what you're seeing in the data on the wealth that is true here, not just in the US, is that as another round of monetary policy easing has happened, it's pushed up asset prices again. Not as much in the UK, but still some of that going on. That effect, what it has done, it hasn't in a simplistic way pushed up wealth inequality as we measure it through the Gini coefficient and things. Again, so it definitely hasn't done that in the UK. What it has done is 2 things. It has created deeper generational gaps, because it's given windfall gains to people that already had wealth, which in a life cycle fashion are older people. And it's prevented access to some of that wealth accumulation for the young. Housing is the obvious example that everyone in the UK is obsessed about. They're ruining every dinner party conversation in London for like the last 30 years. But what it has also done is although it has not it's not increased the Gini coefficient on wealth. What it has done is to raise the gaps, the absolute cash gaps between people in terms of their wealth. And the reason that matters is because it means that in Britain today, unlike in the 80s, you cannot earn your way to being wealthy, because your income is just too small compared to those wealth gaps. And that is what, if you want to worry about something on wealth, that is what I would worry about.
Yeah. So yes, so Piketty. Anyway, we now have a question from Cheng Li, who's asking, how long do you think the COVID-19 will still have an impact on employment in the future? Do you think the COVID-19 can only have a negative impact on employment, or could there be a bright side? And in this post-COVID age, which we hope to get to soon, do you have some suggestions for what are going to be new areas for employment?
Okay, so I'm obviously no expert on the epidemiology or the vaccine rollout. So all I'm doing there is reading the consensus surveys of people that do know a lot more than me. So I don't have anything useful to add on that. What I would say is that history says that unemployment is quite stubborn at coming back down after crises, and that is not what the OBR and the Bank of England are forecasting this time. They're forecasting a quicker than normal bounce back in employment. I think the reason for thinking that might be plausible, even if we don't agree that people are going to go and spend all their money again, is because that very sectorally focused nature of the crisis, where we've shut down whole sectors and then we reopen them when we get a vaccine going and things, I think that is easier to drive a faster growth in employment, because if you have just generalized lower demand across the whole economy and then demand slightly increases again, then all those firms can basically just service that demand by working the existing workforce a bit harder because they're a bit nervous about hiring new people in a recovery phase. That's what we tend to see. If in this case it's not a generalized problem, but we've shut down the restaurants, if those restaurants open, they have to hire new workers to be able to satisfy the demand. They can't make do with the kind of 2 workers because they haven't got any workers. So I think there are some reasons for thinking it might be faster. The counter arguments are it's a much deeper recession. It's global. Like we called the financial crisis a global financial crisis because we're an Anglosphere and a developed world focused bunch of people. This one actually is a global crisis, unlike the global financial crisis, which was basically for Europe and for the USA going on. So I think that is how that plays out. We do have to have solved this for the world, not just for the UK, to get back to proper growth. And on where jobs growth will come from, I think some of it is the new shiny stuff that we all want to talk about, including myself, on green jobs and other things. And I hope that happens. And the government, is still talking about very large sums of money on the investment side, not as much as some of us would like, but quite a lot. I don't discount, though, that the jobs growth will probably look in volume terms quite similar to pre-financial crisis, where the biggest jobs growth was health and social care. Remember, the 2020s is the decade when we actually get the growth in the over 65 population kicking in as the boomers hit it. So it's now. So health and social care, and then it is hospitality and leisure, and it is high-end services that are probably on. If you're purely asking me which sectors will see the biggest jobs growth in the 2020s, I'm afraid I think it is those. I would like it also to be in green jobs too, obviously.
Good. Well, perhaps we'll come back to that. But there's a sort of continuing in a related theme. So there's a question from Paul Stevens, and he's asking, so COVID has hit hospitality and leisure. As you say, these will probably recover. But nobody's talking much about the hit to high value industries such as aerospace. And how much of a worry is this? And what are the spatial implications of that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And that is a good example of something that is really important that gets lost in because it's not as big as the other things I was talking about. So I think that's totally fair. And so everything I've said about hospitality and leisure, my relative optimism there does not apply to the aerospace sector in the short term. I think that sector is very dependent on what we've just said about the global, how quickly we deal with the vaccination and the global prevalence of the disease. So it's imaginable that it could look more like hospitality and leisure, but there's definitely a scenario that sees longer term suppressed activity in that sector. And that will have, because there are some parts of the UK, I'm thinking around Derby, the North Wales, England border, some bits near Bristol that are particularly, or at least there's a disproportionate number of high-paying jobs that are dependent on that sector. I think that is a worry. You can also see it, by the way. I mean, look at what's happening around airports. They're not high-paying jobs, but you do not want to be around Gatwick for a job. For a lot, like everybody is furloughed. Incomes are a disaster. Unemployment is a disaster. So I think that is totally fair, and that I didn't have time to do justice to that because it's slipping under the radar. But I think we should definitely and policy should focus on that because that is a sector-specific thing we can deal with.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, French are very, very worried about Toulouse because that's aerospace, and it's the same kind of problem. And there's been a lot more talk in France actually than there has been here about what to do about that. And now we have a question from Chris Harker, who's one of my colleagues at the IGP. And he's asking, how does the Resolution Foundation approach the problem of economic illiteracy in the policy sphere, so government, media, and some economists? For example, there are crucial differences between QE and other kinds of public debt, which are largely ignored.
We definitely don't solve that. Is the honest answer.
Do something about it.
I'd say, look, no, so we're a charity. Our charitable purpose is education. What do? We talk to everybody. We do high-end research, but we do it in a policy-engaged way so that it's not trying to get people interested in things that just we care about, but it's things they're having to actually deal with today. I'll give you the QE point you make is completely fair. I'll give you a really concrete example, which is earlier I said that our debt costs have become more volatile based on what happens to interest rates. And one of the reasons for that I don't think anyone appreciates, some of it is obvious, which is there's a lot more of that debt is getting rolled over more often. But one of the reasons is that what QE does is to mean that the government debt that is taken onto the Bank of England's balance sheet is automatically, the cost of it to government is automatically tied to the Bank of England, to interest rates. Okay, so if interest rates rise, it automatically goes up. So QE materially changes debt dynamics in a world where we have very large percentages of our debt held by the central bank, which, yes, you're absolutely right. No policymaker has ever raised that with me outside of kind of the techie bits of the Bank of England. Let's not set ourselves, though, we have a system in the UK that has elected representatives filling our cabinet and our ministerial jobs, unlike in the US. Janet Yellen definitely couldn't be our chancellor, even if she can be the Treasury Secretary. And so I've learned to live in the world as it exists rather than I might like it to be, which I think is a healthy way to get through life in general.
But the point about economic illiteracy, I think, is important, isn't it? Because the Financial Times has just put a huge amount of money into trying to get people to be more economically literate.
Yeah, it's brilliant. What they're doing is really good. It's going to take a long time, is all I'm saying.
Yes, well, I think, but it's very important. I think it's going to become an important part of democratic politics, because people feel seriously that the economy is one of these great scams.
Yeah,
I mean,
there was a really good study done this week by a ONS sponsored body and one of our friend organisations, NISA, that was digging into some of these questions about public levels of understanding. And obviously no one has a clue what GDP, and they kind of only vaguely understand what unemployment means. They actually do. I'll tell you what, the things they understand are wages, inflation, the things that are affecting them like day to day is what they understand.
Yeah.
Totally right.
So now we have a question from Tingri Zhang, who's saying, we all hope the COVID pandemic will pass as fast as it can. And it's being said now that we're going to be in a sort of post-COVID future, so something defined by post-COVID, for at least the next 5 to 10 years. I mean, do you think this is true? So that's the first part of the question. And even though the vaccine will be produced and distributed around the world, it'll be a long process. So could you please give some advice to us ordinary people to plan our future in the post-COVID thing? How are you planning your future, Torsten? Should Ingrid plan hers?
Yeah, I was going to say, I definitely feel underqualified to provide that advice. The way I'll try to offer you a way that I'm thinking about that question, okay, which is to try to step back and think about what does the 2020s represent, like for British economic policy making, how should we think about it? Because and at one level, obviously right now it's very hard to feel like it's anything other than like just COVID's going to dominate everything, basically, because it's public finances, household finances, lived experiences, death of loved ones, the lot. I think a better way of thinking about it, I think, is a decade with a lot of economic change in it. And that is because it's not just because of COVID, although we touched on some of the economic changes that will bring. It's because COVID is happening at exactly the same time as Brexit. So, which is obviously UK specific in it. And the level of that needs a reorganization of our economy that slowly happens over time, given our new comparative advantage, new set of endowments and challenges. And it's also happening at exactly the same time as we seriously get onto the business of delivering on our net zero transition. And as we are a society, it's when the demographic bulge moves, it's when it affects the labour market, when we see the big exit from the labour market of the baby boomers. So I think of the 2020s, I generally am skeptical of grand theories that say everything's changing faster than it's ever changed. Most of the data shows me that things are changing less than ever. In general, people are moving house less, they kind of take drugs less, they do everything less. The lack of people moving jobs in Britain is kind of staggering. It's like, anyway, but I think the 2020s is a bit different in the sense that it's not the kind of pop change on technology and things people want to talk about, but these big shock-driven changes are bigger in the 2020s than they have been recently. And that's how I think I would think about it, as how do we navigate a higher level of change rather than how do I cope with individual aspects of it. So what we need societally is resilience to that change. We're not going to be able to micromanage each aspect of it.
No, that's a good response, I think, to that. And now we have a question from Matt Davies, who's again one of my colleagues in the IGP, and he's able to ask it live. So Matt, please.
Hi, Torsten. Thanks for a wonderful presentation. Really enjoyed it. I've probably got far too many questions. I'm going to be a little bit cheeky and ask you two if I can.
Okay.
First of all, it strikes me that it's just amazing how this pandemic has overtaken our consciousness. And so there's an obvious question that we haven't yet touched on, which was the previous thing that was occupying all of our consciousness, which is obviously Brexit. So I was just wondering if you had some thoughts about how Brexit impacts some of the trends that you outlined. And then secondly, I was just interested on some of your thoughts on the sort of differential responses of the regional governments and impacts you think we might see differently regionally across Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and whether you think any of those are doing a better job perhaps than the UK government.
Okay, those are very different questions. On Brexit, like you say, it is at one level kind of almost farcical that this like huge thing is happening and literally no attention is like the big debate is who's going to be allowed to have turkey with who at Christmas, while this like life-changing material decision is being made about the future of our economy. So obviously you're right. I think I'll say two things on the economics. So we may as well use the OBR's figures from yesterday. So I said to you that their projection is for COVID to cause a 3% permanent loss of GDP. So forget the really big hit right now, but the permanent effect. In contrast, their estimate of the permanent loss of GDP from a no-deal Brexit is 5.5%. So it's twice the loss from COVID. From a deal Brexit, it's 4%. So it's a 1.5% extra loss if you get no deal, which in the fact that it's 4, by the way, it just shows you how far Britain's come from discussing whether it's a soft or a hard Brexit. So we're debating which form of hard Brexit we would like. So, but either way, it's significantly more than the effect of COVID on these numbers. I would say the hit is to very different parts of the economy. It's to the tradable sectors, not to the non-tradable service sectors that are at the heart of the COVID crisis. And that's worth reflecting on. My honest view is that we will get a deal, and that is what, short of like a really painful either political or kind of performative disaster, as we kind of try to orchestrate towards the end game of this. But on the substance, a deal is eminently doable. In the end, we can fudge fish for a few years, and there aren't that many fishermen, and it can be fudged for a few years quite easily, and we can still say we're getting back control in a few years. And in the end, the government doesn't care that much about the things on state aid. So it's beyond me that if we don't do a deal, there's got to be a really strong reason for it, and I don't see what it is. So so that's my case for optimism. I also think there's a general thing, which is in their heart of hearts, not all, but even most of the soft bits of the Brexit bits of government don't actually want the decline of the West. And and I don't want to overdo it, but there's a slight danger that we're all the debate is about state aid or it's about fisheries. And I do care about these individual bits of the negotiation, but really what matters for the long-term future is, have we got a cooperative relationship with our major allies, the Europeans and America. And that has been thrown more into doubt over the last decade. And that is happening in a world that we've learned is much more scary than we thought it was in the early 2000s. So that, I think, is that's what really matters as far as I'm concerned, rather than, does it cost us 50 quid or 100 quid in the short term. On the regional government side of things, I'd say two things. So one, clearly the public perceptions are very different of their leaders across the country, across the nations of the United Kingdom. Much higher support for Nicola Sturgeon and for Mark Drakeford in Wales. I haven't looked at the Northern Ireland data, so I don't feel qualified to talk about that. But you do also see it for regional mayors, in high-profile regional mayors in England. I would caveat that by saying that is not justified by the actual outturns, as it were. So the health impact, actually, we're honest with ourselves, we all failed in all parts of the United Kingdom. And what were the big mistakes? When we locked down and what we did on social care. So like we policy killed a lot of old people in our social care settings, and that same mistake was made in Holyrood and in Westminster and in Cardiff Bay, and locking down late again. Everybody did this. Everyone made the same mistake, and they could have made different choices on that. So I think now I do think communication matters, and I do think the UK government's kind of flip-flopping and messiness of how it communicates has made a material difference. And I think on the economic policy, it's been too slow this autumn. But I think the public perceptions is partly driven by the fact that, like, why is Nicola Sturgeon's response in Scotland so popular? One, she talks like an adult and is slightly more straight with people, even if the policy response is pretty similar. But two, because Boris Johnson is in Downing Street. And everything in politics is relative in life. Whenever chancellors are popular, it's because the prime minister is unpopular. The only time leader of the opposition's ratings go up in the UK is when the prime minister tanks. Like, almost no opposition leader in the UK ever gets more popular on their own initiative. So I would be nervous about concluding too much about the substance from the very big differences in approval ratings, because my basic view is on the big stuff, the outcomes are the same. And that's also true on the economics. And so, for example, if you look at Scotland in the data that's come out today on prevalence rates, Scotland's doing a worse job of getting this second wave under control. But that doesn't fit the narrative of, like, I'm in no way even saying the UK government has done a good job. All I'm really saying is everyone's done a catastrophic job.
Well, that's cheerful. Anyway, we've got a question, another to follow on from Matt's question, from someone who is anonymous, and they're asking, is there a way to restructure future policies so that we're more ready for the next crisis, whatever that, or whenever that is, or do crises-induced policies have to be ad hoc?
That is an excellent question. So the answer, which is painfully obvious, is both. That is because there's some things we should definitely do that would make it easier for us to do well in any future economic crises, whatever the cause. Okay, there's no point coming up with a policy that only works in pandemics. Okay, so I'll give you a really concrete example. So, for 5 years before this pandemic, we spent our time saying to the government and anyone that would listen, the Bank of England used to cut interest rates by 5% in a recession. That was the main way in which we supported the economy in a recession. That cannot happen. The answer is 0.5% is how much they can do this time. And so fiscal policy has to take the strain. And in particular, we need quick fiscal policy to take the strain. And the way that happens is via what we call the automatic stabilizers, the benefits system urgently replacing people's incomes if they fall out of work, or taxes that mean that people's tax rates fall if their income falls. And we should have been explicitly targeting strengthening the automatic stabilizers. By accident, we've accidentally weakened them over the course of the last. The government didn't mean to do this, but post 2010, we've accidentally slightly weakened the automatic stabilizers in the UK. So that would help us deal with any future economic crises. I mean, obviously, all the usual things about wanting a better government in general, like better politicians on all sides, better policymakers would make a difference. I think in the long term, we do have to think about how we remove the constraint on monetary policy caused by the zero lower bound.
Yeah.
Like the discussion, you can take your pick in which the answers are in terms of negative interest rates. My personal view, and again, this is not a conclusive view, but my personal view is we probably need to be thinking harder about a higher inflation target if we permanently want to deal with the problem of the zero lower bound. At the moment, like the welfare losses from the zero lower bound binding are huge. And I think we basically just kind of keep wishing the problem away and hoping it kind of, it will be okay, just one more crisis, which is literally what everyone in the Treasury said to me before this one hit when I was giving them papers saying we've got to deal with this zero lower bound problem. They would say, oh yes, that's very interesting, but we'll probably be okay. It'll be a small recession. We can cut rates a little bit, do some QE, and we can do a lot of public spending. Well, we've muddled our way through doing a lot of public spending, but our fiscal framework hasn't been adjusted at all to deal with that. And then more generally, we were better prepared for a pandemic 15 years ago than we were when this one hit. In fact, most of the surveys showed that we were. Now, I don't want to be, some of that was just about an era of more spending. And if you've got more spending, then you spend it on things that look like they're nice to haves, like PPE stocks and things. But clearly you do need resilience built into your public services, because we don't know which bit of it is going to be the front line of the crisis in future. No,
but we do know that we're going to have more of these kinds of pandemics. So so that we could at least be more prepared for that.
That particular one.
Yeah, well, another zoonotic virus, yes, almost certainly. So I think that I think there could be, much more, not only much more overt planning around that. Of course, in theory, we had a plan, we just didn't implement it, but also much more public discussion around that. And I think, I think now there's the time for the public to be engaged in some of these larger policy, sort of issues. But before we get into all of that, we've got another question from Lily Pandolfi, who's asking you about retail. So she says, you mentioned that retail's taken a hit due to increased spending on online retail. But on the other hand, there are some journalists and economists claiming a sort of revival of the high street and local retail due to people being unable to travel further afield and their need for a sense of community during this time. So what do you think of this contradiction regarding the effects on high streets and retail, and which aspect of this is actually really likely to play out, or how's it going to play out?
That is a great question. So let's go through the different elements of that. So the first thing I should say is that the hit on retail was not as bad as I think lots of us thought it would be. And that is because although overall consumer spending has come down a lot, what we have seen is we've seen a movement of spending that would have taken place in face-to-face services into buying stuff. So it's a reversal of the long-term trend away from buying stuff. Yeah. Most of that, if you look at where it's gone, is into online shopping, and I'm not joking, a lot of DIY stuff has been bought. I don't know whether people have used it or not, but they've intended to improve their houses. Yeah. And their gardens, and they've gone and bought stuff anyway. Lots of bikes. You'll have all seen all the stories about bike shortages rolling out across the developed world. So it's not about the overall volume of retail spend. In fact, retail sales are now back above their pre-crisis level much earlier than we thought. It is about the distribution of that. Some of that is the online versus high street element, which is very large, huge increase in the online retail. Some of it is within parts of retail. So specifically, people selling food have done well. Because basically we're spending, we're not eating out, we're buying ourselves nice stuff from the supermarket. So you can see that in the US as well, in the data on profits from supermarkets coming through. I think there is some evidence on the local high streets doing better. I think there's some evidence. Well, there's definitely evidence of the kind of cultural aspect of that, people wanting it, talking about it. Yeah. There's less conclusive evidence on the spending patterns. What is clear is that the fall in high street retail spending is really big in big city centres and much smaller in smaller high streets where people have residential. So that to that degree, it is true. I'm a bit nervous about, I slightly worry some of those stories, like I see in the FT now and again, are slightly based on, yes, there is very high spending happening in kind of areas where professionals live in London. The nice bits of London where professionals live and commute into central London, those local high streets are seeing lots of spending because there's a lot of people with incredibly large amounts who are desperate to get out of the house. Yeah. So just don't generalize that to the whole country is all I would gently urge the FT to do.
Yes, maybe it was not what's happening in seaside towns, but
Yes, happening in
that's
seaside.
very interesting point. So Torsten, the last question again tonight is from me again, and I'm just wondering about how some of these things that are going to intersect that we're not thinking about. So there's been a lot of chat about how working from home is going to be permanent. And whenever anyone says this to me, I always say I haven't been working from home. I've been living in the office for the last 6 months, which is a very unpleasant place to live permanently. And actually, most people don't want to live in the office. So as you say, there's not necessarily.
In some cases, living in the office with their children, which is the very worst outcome.
Exactly. And with many other people, so you don't want in the office either. So that's a whole set of things. But of course, this is going to have an impact, even if people just work at home 1 or 2 days a week. This is going to have a big impact on office rents. And the question we have to ask in a big city like London is who is invested in those companies which are receiving the rents, and what are they doing, and how do their money connect to the pension of people in the labour market? I mean, there's a whole sort of story here, which we're not hearing too much about. And it's the things I'm concerned about is what's happening on the edges of the main story we're getting, really. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I definitely don't have an answer to that, partly for the reason you're saying, which is, one, it hasn't had a lot of focus, and two, it's very hard to tell.
Very hard, yeah.
Very hard. I think going through the phases, the steps in that logic chain.
Yep.
So the effect on rents, I think, hard for there not to be an effect on aggregate rents. So rents have got to fall generally. I also think probably actually household rents will also fall because income levels are lower, and in the end, what drives rent levels is income level. I think in the short term you get adjustment pains in that environment. That does cause problems and reallocation challenges. In the medium term, in terms of how that plays out, I think the problem is that it isn't necessarily as bad for central London, I think, as some of the stories say, because if you think about it, the place that has a problem is the marginal office. So rents fall, they adjust. People that couldn't afford to have an office in central London maybe now can, because the other place people want less space. Yeah. So the actual problem is, I think we should focus a bit more on is, remember, one of the challenges of making your ex-retail high street a success is that you need to combine some residential with some office space, because that's what drives spending. And then you need your leisure, your high-end leisure. I do slightly worry that for the marginal areas, because people will be able to afford rents for the smaller amount of space they want in the more premium areas, it's not clear to me that the loser we should be worried about is central London in terms of geography. Yeah. But I say that with no great certainty. No. What is true is what you're saying, which is then someone has to lose from that lower rents. Like, we all may win as consumers or as business owners from lower rents, but someone has to lose. And in the end, that is the people that own the profit share of the economy, a large chunk of which in the UK is pension funds. It's pensions,
yes, I know. It is slightly worrying. Let's see how that pans out and whether anybody starts, well, maybe the Resolution Foundation can do an analysis on that.
Not too hard.
Torsten, we're very much out of time, and in fact we've gone a couple of minutes over. I just want to thank you very much for a fantastic presentation and great incitement on the part of the audience, good questions and good discussion. And I know you're going on to do even another event tonight, so I don't know how you'll manage that, but we're very, very pleased to see you at the IGP, and thank you, and please come and see us again. So I'm just going to ask the panel to give you a round of applause, because the panel can actually unmute.
All right.
So they can do that.
That hasn't happened in months.
Yeah.
That's very kind indeed. Thank you for the time, and good luck with all the work with the institute and with the students and everything. I'm glad somebody's doing some policy engaged work.
Ah, fantastic. Okay, good. Well, we'll see you soon, I hope. Yeah. Thanks very much, Torsten. Good night. Thank you. Bye-bye.